Welcome to lesson 2. Please be reminded that this lesson, as with the previous one, will be presented in 2 parts. So today we are going to be looking at the topic understanding the development of the land use process. So one of the first things we need to understand is the role that risk plays in land use planning. Now remember, when we look at the land use planning process and the concepts behind land use, we know that land use planning must be an integrative and very comprehensive approach that takes into consideration both your natural, social, and economic factors. And the way in which we develop land can either increase the risk of hazards or decrease the risk of hazards. So let us look at a definition according to the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, how they define risk. And it says that risk refers to the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses such as might occur with deaths, injuries, damage to properties, livelihood, economic activities, etc., and environmental damage occurring. All of this resulting from the interactions that occur between the natural environment and human beings that, as mentioned before, that can either induce hazards or create conditions of vulnerability. Now, if you recall, when you did ENVS 215 disaster management, you would have learned the term risk before. And for some of you, this simple formula here may be familiar to you. And so we know that risk is actually the convergence or the outcome of the interaction between hazards in an area, the vulnerabilities or pre-existing conditions that are present in relation to the capacity of that community or environment to handle the consequences of that hazard, and the way in which each of these factors relate to the other will determine the level of risk that occurs. Now, within the past 20 years, Trinidad and Tobago's landscape has changed dramatically. And this has been due to increased development, especially in certain areas of Trinidad and Tobago. And this has resulted in the intensification of the built environment, built infrastructure. Now, some of you may actually be old enough to be aware of some of these changes and how it has occurred over time. And where your landscape changes, and it changes from a natural one to a human built environment, we know that if this is done indiscriminately, we can have a lot of negative consequences for the natural environment, resulting in potential hazards occurring. Now, much of the Trinidad and Tobago's population is also located along Trinidad's west coastline. And this is evident in the geographic location of our 3 largest cities in Trinidad. For example, we have Port of Spain in the northwest, Chaguanas just south of that, also along the west coastline, and then we have San Fernando to the south, also along the western coastline, with Scarborough in Tobago being the largest city. So clearly we can see a pattern of human development concentrated in the west and also in the north of Trinidad along your east-west corridor. Now here we have a chart courtesy of a preliminary vulnerability assessment for Trinidad and Tobago compiled by the ODPM in 2014 that summarizes a number of different types of hazards that Trinidad and Tobago is susceptible to, or in other words, vulnerable to. Many of these we are vulnerable to them, particularly the natural hazards. by virtue of our geographic location, namely being located in a volcanic region and tectonic activity. A lot of tectonic activity happens in the geographic location where we are, because Trinidad in particular is located on the edge of the South American plate that meets the Caribbean plate. Additionally, because of the type of industry concentrations we have, we are also susceptible or vulnerable to certain types of man-made hazards. So according to this chart, we have our hazards grouped by natural hazards and man-made hazards, anthropogenic. That's what it means. For example, as mentioned before, because of our geographic location, Trinidad and Tobago as well, we are susceptible to a number of earthquakes and the various hazards that would be associated with these earthquakes. For example, tsunamis, liquefaction, mud volcanoes, etc. Now I want to point out, at this particular point in time, today is the 14th of February 2018. Just yesterday, on Tuesday the 13th, we had an eruption of the Devil's Woodyard volcano, mud volcano, and it's interesting to note that according to news reports, we have not had an eruption of that scale since I believe it's 1995, more than 20 years ago. And when you see things like this happen, it's actually an indication of increased tectonic activity taking place in the region. Also, because of our geographic location, we find that Trinidad and Tobago, we are susceptible to hurricanes and tropical storm disturbances associated with increased rainfall. We find that we'll be susceptible also to flooding, landslides, high winds, etc. If you follow with me, you will see that some of these hazards actually can occur both as a result of natural causes as well as human causes, such as pollution, fires, etc. Even disease can occur as a result of natural consequences or human causes. Anthropogenic hazards, we as a nation, we are susceptible to various forms of terrorism, including cyber terrorism. Some of the consequences of this can be major accidents and failures to our transport system and our infrastructure, interruption in various services such as our power, telecommunications, etc. So disruptions there can have serious consequences for our nation, even on an economic and social level. Also mentioned here is the possibility or the increased vulnerability of Trinidad and Tobago, in particular Trinidad, to industrial hazards, industrial and technical hazards, such as fires and explosions, leaks, spills, etc. And this is because of the heavy reliance of Trinidad and Tobago on industry in our economy and our development. So it's important for us to understand the various types of hazards that our nation is vulnerable to. Now here we just have a map also provided from the same document that shows in a little more detail in terms of our tectonic vulnerability. One area for major concern is along the central range in Trinidad and Tobago. Now here this overview map shows us exactly where the trend of this line and activity takes place. Note some of the areas that are very close to this region, Pointe-a-Pierre in particular, and even San Fernando. And the reason I want you to note these areas is because these are areas, particularly the Pointe-a-Pierre area, where we have a heavy concentration of industrial development. So along this line, historically speaking, we have had a lot of tectonic activity taking place, and geologists are very concerned that this area in particular is highly vulnerable to tectonic activity. So when you combine that vulnerability because of the geology in that area to the presence of industrial activity close by, we have an increased risk of industrial hazards occurring in that area. Now, it has been noted over recent years that the most frequently occurring hazards affecting Trinidad and Tobago are actually flooding, landslides, high winds events, and fires, particularly during the dry season. You know that we are highly vulnerable to forest fires and bushfires. But what I also want you to note is, even though these are the most frequently occurring hazards, as we have already seen in the previous slide, that we are still vulnerable to many other types of hazards, even though they may not be occurring in the frequency that these listed on this slide have been identified. I want us to look briefly at our economic vulnerability as well. Here I have a snapshot that was taken from a review of the economy, that is Trinidad and Tobago's economy in 2013, and I want you to note that Trinidad and Tobago's economy is highly dependent on petroleum and manufacturing, and in particular I want you to pay attention to the numbers for petroleum. So this chart gives us an idea of how that dependence has grown over time from 2009 to 2013. Let's look at the numbers briefly. So at the top, this is our gross domestic product, so that would be set at 100%. So these numbers are in percentages. Petroleum economy, look at how it has increased from 2009, 34.6%, to 2013, 42.9%. That means from that period of time, starting from 2009, we have had an increase in contribution from the petroleum industry to our national production, or to our national economy. Manufacturing as well has also increased over that period. Services of various types, we notice, has fluctuated, right? But what I want you to notice, there is an increase in concern here, because with regards to petroleum contribution, because what happens is that means that you have an increase in reliance on a particular sector, and when you have an increase in reliance on a particular sector within your economy, that increases your vulnerability should something happen to impair or impact that sector, as we have been experiencing in recent years. Some of the things that can occur can be shifts in the global market. For example, various factors can cause oil prices to plummet, which has happened, and it can cause it to rise. So our economy will become vulnerable to these shifts and these changes. Dependence on exports of oil and gas. External market demands can affect our GDP. So I'm not only talking about oil prices, but the demand in various markets. For example, we find there is an increasing move in the US and North America to start extracting shale oil, which means that the US local stores of petroleum is likely to increase, and when that increases, it means that their demand for our petroleum products can be reduced. So this can affect our local production as well, and our local our GDP. Gas, on the other hand, provides strong economic support, but it has never been strong enough to protect against the fluctuations in oil prices. When we have a robust economy, which is usually facilitated by diversification of economy, a robust economy can actually build up the resilience or the strength of your economy to all of these various types of shifting situations that have been impacting our economy in recent years. Long-term benefits can also be gained from investing in prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. For example, as I mentioned before, diversification would be part of that strategy for prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. Additionally, that can also be applied to the natural environment where you have increased vulnerabilities and potential for hazards that can actually impact the economy as well. So as I mentioned, the economy can be affected by natural events such as natural disasters, and as mentioned before, there are many hazards that Trinidad is potentially vulnerable to. Another issue for concern is the fact that small islands typically have less resources than larger countries that have larger land masses. Where you have larger land masses, you potentially have larger amounts of natural resources by virtue of having a larger land mass. So as a result of the fact that we are small islands, we are less able to produce at a larger scale at a lower cost because we have less land space available to us. And again, as mentioned before, because our economy does not reflect a trend to diversification very well, there have been attempts in recent times, but no government present or previous has really been driving this forward with any sense of urgency, and as a result we find that our economy remains at risk. So Trinidad and Tobago needs to ensure that our ability to cope financially, that there are mechanisms in place and available for disaster management, particularly in times where recovery and rehabilitation is needed after some kind of event has occurred. Some of the sources of funding available to Trinidad and Tobago in times of disaster include the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. In recent times, you've been hearing in the news that the government has had the need to draw down on this fund in order to attempt to stabilize the economy as we have moved into recession. Other funds that we have available to us would be the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. This is a regional disaster insurance fund of which Trinidad and Tobago is party to. The United Nations Emergency Relief Fund, the Inter-American Emergency Aid Fund, and also the Caribbean Development Bank. So these are various sources of financial assistance and financial funding that the country can have access to in order to stabilize the economy in times of need. So at this point, I would like to ask you to please proceed to part 2 of today's lesson.